at the bottom of the screen. Now you'll notice that this menu is scrollable and you can change the order and create your own presets, but thankfully we already have a cinematic option created. So rather than adding a new one, just click on the pen icon next to that. And here we're going to click on our resolution and FPS. We're going to choose 5K to get the most resolution out of our footage. And then in terms of frame rate, we're going to choose either 30 or 24. Next, we're going to click on lens, and this is where you can choose either to go wide and get that typical GoPro fisheye, but that's not a particularly cinematic look. So our next options, or next best options, are linear or linear and horizon leveling. So while the horizon leveling works fantastically, it also crops in your image a bit. So if you can, try and stick with linear, but if you find that you're rotating within your shot and want to try and keep your shots level, surprise, turn on horizon leveling. And then of course you come to your hyper smooth, which is GoPro's term for stabilization. And while this has been improved, this is the third iteration on this GoPro, you have more options. So you could choose hyper smooth on. It's going to crop in by about 10%, but trust me on this one, you'll probably want that stabilization. And then if you find that you've got very unsteady hands, or you're in a place where you're not sure if you're going to get particularly smooth shots, you can always turn that to boost. Now we're going to skip the next few menu items and scroll down to our Pro Tune modes. Now typically these settings were set at the global GoPro level, but since you have this new menu structure and these shooting modes, you can set it per shooting mode. Surprise, surprise. So our first is bitrate. Now this is essentially how much data is collected in your shot. If you shoot high, you're going to wildly increase the size of your files, but you're also going to collect more information in your shot, which means that when it comes to color correction, color grading, transforming your shot in post, you're going to have much more information to be able to deal with. So if you have a memory card big enough and fast enough, shoot high, but if not, shoot for standard, and you should get a decent enough shot. Now our next is shutter, and this is where I mentioned at the beginning of the video where we're going to be doing a part 2 over ND filters. Now this is where they really come into play. So a super quick rundown, you'll want this value to be double the frame rate. So you'll find that if your shutter speed isn't double your frame rate and is something drastic, so in this case, let's say your shutter is at 1/384 and you're shooting at 5K 30 frames per second, this is going to make your footage look choppy and remove that lovely motion blur that is synonymous with cinematic type shots. In addition, while the shutter speed helps to make your footage look smooth, it also controls how much light is allowed into the sensor. So since we selected 5K 30 frames per second, you'll find that EV comp is blanked out here. That's because it's not available at 5K 30, but if we switch to 5K 24 frames per second, it becomes available. This could be its whole own video on its own, but going to give a super quick crash course at the highest level possible. So if you find that you're shooting in really harsh, bright conditions and your histogram is showing all your information over to the left, trying to think about how all the way over to the left, then you're going to want to bump up your EV comp by either +1 or +2. Moving on to white balance, this is overall going to control the temperature of your shot, so it's either going to make it look colder, more of a blue color, or warmer, more of an orangey color. So typically, white balance does pretty well, but it's always good to actually set this rather than have it fluctuate mid-shot. But if you're not sure exactly what temperature you want, I suggest going with something like a 4500 Kelvin, a pretty neutral color in general. Next, we're going to be talking about ISO min and ISO max as a single feature. So having a wide variance between these values will mean that there's going to be a lot of fluctuation in the overall sensor's sensitivity to light in your shot, which means that you could get fluctuations in how bright or dark your shot is. So in this case, I suggest setting this to 100 for the minimum and 2, maybe 300 for the max. And that's going to ensure that you don't have those big jumps during your shot. And then you have sharpness, which I'd say is pretty self-explanatory, but some people quite like a soft look to their footage. It's kind of a more of a retro type look. However, GoPros in their own sense are pretty soft in general. Nothing's really in focus. So I suggest bumping this up to high to try and make sure that whatever you are shooting is in focus as much as possible. And our final main setting that we're going to actually make changes to is the color profile. This is also where you're going to see the biggest difference, both when you're shooting and when it comes to editing. So I suggest here, if you know what you're doing with color correcting, color grading, or if you're trying to apply LUTs, keep this at flat. But if you're not wanting to do any of that color grading or anything like that, keep this in full color, because the flat will drastically make your footage look very flat, desaturated, and just overall gray. And then you have raw audio and wind, which in my opinion, you're never really going to be using the volume or the audio that comes out of a GoPro. You're more often going to be using an audio track or additional sound effects. So I wouldn't really worry about these too much. If you do want to save some memory in your shots, turn your raw audio to off. So now, if you follow those instructions, your GoPro is